Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Albums I Hated But Grew to Love. Part 2. There was a part 1 that posted yesterday. You can check that out if you're interested. In fact, I'll leave a link in the description for you. But with all the great albums that our favorite bands have released, there's bound to be a few missteps, a few clunkers and duds, things in there that upon first listen, at least for me, I wasn't able to get into. They were ones that I simply did not enjoy. Now, sometimes those albums would remain my least favorite albums by those bands, but other times they would grow on me and I would wonder why the heck it is that I didn't like that album when it first came out. And so I've got 10 of those such albums here to run through with you as part of part 2. Remember, there was a part 1. You can check that out. And we're going to do that right now. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, if you turn on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool episodes like this with albums I hated but grew to love. And so yesterday's episode, part 1, was A through M, but we're also going to pick up and we're going to start with M and run through the rest of the alphabet Z. So starting with M, Motley Crue, Saints of Los Angeles, 2008 ninth studio album. And this one here was a reunion album with Tommy Lee, so it's kind of a big deal. All 4 original guys back together. It was also a concept album loosely based on their autobiography or their biography, The Dirt. And the thing is, like Generation Swine, this was another one where they attempted to modernize their sound. Garage rock was having a revival at that time, and so they stripped back their sound and production. Something that I think was, they were known for and so forth. And they stripped that away. It's a darker, muddier sound, sounding more contemporary. And when I got this album, save for the title track on here, I just did not like anything else on it. In time, I warmed up to that new sound that's on this album, and I kind of had to accept the fact that they're never going to make another Dr. Feelgood sounding album or like one of the first 5 even. And so it has grown on me in time, and I think that's going to be the key thing about what we're talking about today, is that most of these albums just took time. Once the shock of the albums not sounding like what you'd expect or what you'd even want the albums to sound like, that's usually when I was able to get into these. It's just that has to, wash away first so that you can finally accept it for what it is. And I'd like to try to do that whenever I can. Sometimes there's albums, no matter how hard I try, I'm never going to get into. This being one that I certainly could, so will be the next 9 that are in here. And this one here is probably one that will surprise a lot of people, but didn't click with me. Pantera, Cowboys from Hell from 1990, 5th studio album. This one was just something I was not into when I heard it. And I was not familiar with their first 4 albums before this that were more of the glam metal, power metal style and so forth. Those were not on a major label. This was the first major label release. So it wasn't anything to do with the fact that I was into glam metal and they had changed their sound. I didn't know anything about them. But I was just not into it. It would actually take a few more years later, when Vulgar Display of Power came out in 1992, that I ended up enjoying that album and going back to this one. And then sort of the light bulb went on and I said, I understand why it was that everybody was digging this album and so forth. But it just did not click with me at the time. It just took some time, and ultimately I did get into it. Next one up, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Mojo from 2010, 12th studio album. And this here was the band's attempt to create a blues-based album, and it was something they described as the type of music that they enjoyed playing. So not what they were writing as the band and that sort of stuff, but if they're just jamming and having a good time, it was usually on blues-style sounding songs, and so they actually wanted to make an album of that. But that's not what I think of when it comes to Tom Petty. I'm usually thinking of the more, southern rock, heartland style rock, that sort of stuff. And I just don't hear a lot of blues rock in what they do, at least not what's on this album here. But I'll honestly say that I think that the album itself suffers from the way that it was sequenced, because after I finally, again, you lose that shock of this album not sounding like a Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers album. I found that it was the second half of the album I enjoyed a lot, and I think maybe if the album had been sequenced differently, I actually probably could have warmed up to it easier and not have had the big shock to where I didn't enjoy it and was sort of turned off by it, because it was actually one of those things where I was in a Barnes and Nobles that was playing it, and I didn't know what it was at first, and they were at the second half of the album, and I ended up really enjoying it. And when I found out that it was this album, then I was actually glad that I still had the album and I could go back to it. And since then, I've actually really enjoyed the album. All right, next one, Queen, The Cosmos Rocks, 2008, 16th studio album. First one to not feature Freddie Mercury, their original frontman, but now bringing in Paul Rodgers of Bad Company. And that's the thing that turned me off on this, was that I was expecting the big, bombastic, over-the-top, punk rock sort of sound that was Queen. And that's really gone here. This is basically blues rock style. It's like a Bad Company album that features Queen on it. And I definitely think it would have fit better had it come out under Bad Company featuring Queen and not the other way around. But I went into this thinking we were going to hear Queen, and it's just not really the case. I do like the album. Again, I had to let that shock of it not sounding like a Queen album wear off, and then I got into it, and it's just, you got great players, you got great music on here, and I can take it for what it is now and enjoy it for that. Next one up, Rat, self-titled release from 1999, 7th studio album. They recorded this one as a 4-piece. But it was a style departure for the band. They didn't do it in the signature style that they had come up with. This essentially was a reunion album. They had put out an album before this called Collage. I think it was in 1997. But that was made up of outtakes and things of that nature and a few finished off tracks. But this was the first new album that they had done, and there was less of the glam metal elements that they were known for. There was much more of the slower grooves and straightforward sort of hard rock sound and stuff. And when I first heard this, I was just like, where is all the stuff that I love about Rat? It's not here. You still had Stephen Pearcy singing, so that helped keep me engaged with it, but it took many, many listens, basically forcing myself to the point where then after time of going back to the album, it was sort of like, oh, yeah, I did like this song. Oh, yeah, this is a good one. Wait, what's that next one that's coming up? And it slowly grew on me, where now, when I want something that is not overplayed by Rat, I will go back to this album. And I end up going back to it quite a bit, in fact. All right, now here's one I know that's going to shock a lot of people on here, and I can't really explain why this is, but Rush, 2112 from 1976, 4th studio album. I did not or could not get into it at the time that I got into Rush. I was born in 1976, so I was not around when this one first came out. I got into Rush during Roll the Bones, Presto, and Going Forward. Those are very different albums than this here, and I think that's why. But Roll the Bones helped get me into prog. That's not a very prog-sounding Rush album, Roll the Bones. This one here is far more prog rock. It's right in the middle of all that sort of stuff. So I think at the time when I was thinking a big Rush fan at that time in the early 90s and buying those albums and stuff, and I wanted more. And this one I heard a lot about, and I listened to it, and I really couldn't get into it. But I've had it on my shelf for a long time, and then this one here, which is a recent reissue of it, I found myself enjoying it more and more and more over the years. But I also think that there's partly because there was no standout hits on it, at least not in terms of what gets played all over the radio and stuff. I now know that I recognize the song Temples of Cyrenaics on here, but there isn't, their big songs like Tom Sawyer, Limelight, and stuff like that, Fly By Night and so forth. And so I think when I went to listen to it originally and then not having any one of those songs to pull me into it, the sort of long, drawn-out, proggy sort of stuff that was on here didn't do it for me. But I'm a huge prog fan, and I've given it a fresh listen over the years and now find myself really enjoying the album. And again, this is why I don't get rid of anything, and I'm glad that I have a library of music, because I can pull out albums that I haven't listened to very often or think that I don't enjoy, and then suddenly it's like having brand new material by that band, because it clicks at that point for some reason, even though it never did before that. Okay, next one up, Skid Row, Subhuman Race from 1995, third studio album and follow-up to the multi-platinum Slave to the Grind. This one would also be the last one to feature Sebastian Bach on it. Here's another one produced by Bob Rock. We talked a lot about him yesterday in part 1 of this series. But the pairing of Bob Rock with Skid Row, you would think would be great. I mean, I liked Dr. Feelgood that he did with Motley Crue. I liked Metallica's Black Album. You know, he did The Cult, Sonic Temple. So it was just one of those things that was, okay, this should be really great. And then, you know, they down-tuned the guitars. The production on this was muddied. I felt that the music was very uninspiring on here, far less energy on this than their 2 previous albums. So at the time, I was very turned off by this. And I didn't pick it up for quite some time. And later on, I would pick it up when I was, you know, jonesing for some new Skid Row after the band had broken up and so forth before reuniting with Johnny Solinger. And finding that there was some good tracks on it, but, you know, didn't really hold me over. And just over time, listening to this album and actually finding I really, really quite enjoy this album. It'll never replace their first 2 albums, but I actually now really enjoy this album far more than I ever did when I first got it. All right, next one up, Warrant, Dog Eat Dog from 1992, third studio album. You know, like a lot of bands from this era, they were going and trying to modernize sound, and these glam metal bands were going heavier or adding grunge elements, stuff like that. And this one here, they sort of shed the pop metal sound from what they were doing to the harder edge, as evident by first single, Machine Gun. And at the time, that really turned me off. I just thought the song was cheesy. I thought the video was cheesy. I didn't like the whole black leather matching outfit thing they were doing. It was just kind of, I don't know. And then when I eventually picked this album up for very cheap later on in the 90s, kind of a thing, again, because I wanted something more like the first 2 albums. And I found that there's actually still a lot of that on here. It was just that it was kind of hidden on here. It wasn't right up in your face like their previous albums, but they did maintain some of the gang style vocals that they had made popular, like Skid Row had done. There was still, you know, melody and production and stuff like that, but it was just done on other songs and so forth. So one of my favorite songs of theirs, of all of their songs, is Hollywood So Far So Good, that's on here. And just, I was kind of shocked when I first heard that song and found out it was on this album, which was actually what made me go get this album. I was hearing it off of a best of collection and said, I better give that album another chance. And so I did, and found out that I far more enjoyed it. Next one, Yes, Heaven and Earth from 2014, their 21st studio album. First one to feature new vocalist John Davison, and last one to feature founding member and bassist Chris Squire before his passing. So for this album here, I don't know if this is what really shifted it or not, but he took a very active role, writing or co-writing 7 of the 8 songs on here. So not done by, say, Steve Howe or someone who normally had defined the sound of Yes. And the album itself is decidedly very mellow. It's just something that when I first heard, there wasn't anything that stuck with me. And I would say this one took a solid year or maybe even longer, where about a year or so after its release, I started pulling it out and finding that, oh, this is actually pretty good, and start it over and play it again. And when I would go to pull out a Yes album, I would go for this one. So it's not in the typical style of Yes that we all love back from the 70s and so forth. It's not overly prog sounding. And it's definitely not like the 80s stuff either. But at the same time, I have found that it grew on me despite it being a different sounding style of Yes. I actually quite enjoy it. And in tandem, I actually really enjoy their last album, The Quest, which I know a lot of people didn't like either. And these 2 albums kind of go hand in hand, but I think maybe because I warmed up to this one, I actually ended up liking The Quest right away. All right, last one we're going to talk about here, ZZ Top, Rhythmine from 1996, 12th studio album. Last one to feature longtime producer Bill Ham on it. And I would have thought that that would have guaranteed this one to have sounded like all the other ones and so forth, but they made a big musical shift on this one. They dropped the 80s layered production sound in the keyboards and all of that. It was 1996, so I get it, but I loved the sound from the 80s, and that was gone. And it was just 3 instruments, the guitar, the bass, the drums, and then you add the vocals in on that, and it was very stripped away. But on top of that, I probably could have just gone for that. They did some really low guitar tunings as well, which mirrored sort of what was going on with the alternative rock and grunge and stuff like that. But it, for me, didn't really fit with what ZZ Top was. So when I heard this, it was such a turnoff. Again, there was just nothing on here that really grabbed me. But I have found that because of that difference in sound, it has made it a much more enjoyable album for me to go back to years later and hear, again, after all that shock and everything has worn off of it not being what I expected it to be. I find it to actually have some really interesting songs on here that I now really enjoy. And that's sort of the case in point with all of these albums here, that in time, my musical taste changed. I warmed up to these things. And now I do love these albums, even though at the time, I originally hated them when they came out. But there you go, 10 more albums that I hated but grew to love. Hopefully you enjoyed this run through. If you didn't watch the first one, do check that out. Remember, I'm leaving a link in the description for you on that. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.